So the main way to control spacing in your CSS is with using these properties called margin and padding. So let's take a look at this. With our H1, there is some spacing already going on here. We can see that the browser does render some space around it. Nothing's just actually touching edges here. And that's because by default, HTML and browsers typically do come with some spacing. But we can control that and we can override that spacing. So for example, with these H1s, I can go in here and I can say, let's set the margin to 0 and let's set the padding to 0. And if I save that, you'll see now they're a lot closer together. So how does this spacing work and when do we use margin versus padding? One of the best ways to understand it is to look at the box model. So let's use our inspector tool here. Right click and inspect element. And then when I hover over this H1, we know that it's selected here. And if I scroll down on the very right here where it says styles, you'll see there's this little box kind of layout. And this is what we call the CSS box model. The CSS box model is just kind of a concept that we can use to know, okay, how much padding are we adding, how much border, and how much margin. Those are the 3 levels of space that we can add to a particular element. So in this case, we're seeing that we have no padding, border, or margin, right? So these are just pretty much standalone content. Now, if you recall, the reason why this blue, when I hover over it, the blue is kind of consuming the full width is because it is set to display block, okay? So typography by default in HTML is going to be set to display block, and all that really means is that it's actually consuming the full width available from the parent container, which in this case would be the body tag, right? So let's look at how padding and margin kind of work together. If I add, say, 10 pixels of padding and I save the file and refresh, you'll see now we've got a little bit more spacing. But where did it add that space? When I hover over it, you can see the green. That's where the actual padding comes in. So padding is the spacing that's directly around the content. That's directly around the actual element, okay? Now, there's another level of spacing we can add, which is border. But border isn't quite spacing. Borders are going to have, a shape to them or an actual physical appearance. So for example, if I say 1 pixel solid border, and we'll color it black and save that, right? It's not quite spacing. It's actually there. There's an actual border there. And we can make the borders pretty thick if we wanted to, like 10 pixels. If I save that, once again, now we're going to have more spacing, but we're spacing it out with an actual border, a physical border. Now, let's leave those borders in and let's add some margin to it. So we'll add another 10 pixels of margin. Now, if I save that, you'll see what's going on here is that we've added 10 pixels around the content, right? So that's why there's a space between this letter A to this actual border here. That's the padding space. Now the border space is the black space that we've added here, and that's what's the border is occupying that space. And now the space between this particular H1 and this other H1, or this H1 and then this H2 element down below it, that space between it is what we call the margin, and you can see that it's shown in orange. So just make sure that you understand that the content itself, when you hover over, especially right here on this box, you can see that the content occupies the blue space. The padding is occupying the green space. Border, of course, in this case is black. And then the margin is the space outside of it. So that's how we control the spacing. And you'll see how we can kind of use padding in one place and margin in another place. And we'll kind of start to learn when one's more appropriate. But just know that the padding is the spacing that's directly around the actual element, whereas margin is kind of the space between other elements in the context. Now, one thing I do want to show you is that this is kind of, we affected the padding and the margin around the entire element. So when we said 10 pixels, we said 10 pixels on the top, left, bottom, and right. We can get a little bit more granular than that by saying something like this. And what this will do is when you have two values in here, that means we're talking about the top and bottom being the first value and the left and right being the second value. So let's do this. Let's make the margin 30 pixels on the left and right. Now if I refresh, you'll see that the top and bottom margins here are 10 pixels, whereas the left and right margins are 30 pixels. They're a little bit thicker on the left and on the right, as you can see. So that's what happens when you have two figures here. When you add three figures in, what it'll do, and let's show you this, we'll do 5 pixels, is this becomes the top value, as you can see here. The middle value becomes the left and right as it was, so that hasn't changed. But the last value, this third value, is now the bottom value. So it's top, right and left, and bottom. And then finally, when you see 4 values there, it's just top, right, bottom, and left. So think clockwise kind of. So if I do 1 pixel on the very left, now if we refresh it, you'll see we've got, I'll hover over this one, 10 on top, 30 on the right, 5 on the bottom, and 1 margin on the left. You can barely even see it, the orange on the left there. So that's how it works when you have 4 figures. A lot of times you'll see developers use that shorthand notation. You might see them do 3 or 2 values. And remember, that means this is the top and bottom, and this is the left and right. We're combining those. We're grouping the actual values there. And then if you see 3, that means, again, this is top, this is left and right, and this is just bottom. And then finally, when you see 4, it's going to be clockwise. Top, right, bottom, and then finally left if we have one. So another way you'll see developers write it that's a little bit more clear than this is they'll say margin left, like that. Say, let's just affect the margin on the left. I'll make that really large so you can see. And now margin left is 200, and the rest are kind of just their default. If you don't specify a margin or a padding level, then they will just default to whatever the browser renders. So you want to be careful with that. Now, I do want to mention one last thing about margin and padding, is that a lot of times developers like to use what we call a CSS reset. I don't recommend you use this unless you're, pretty experienced with CSS, but you can select all of the elements, for example, on the entire page that gets rendered and set the margin and padding to 0. And that's one way of resetting the entire margin and padding for the entire page. And as you can see, now everything's kind of touching each other, and there is no default spacing here other than what we've added here. And if I delete that, for example, you'll see pretty much everything will be lined up touching each other. So that's called a CSS reset. I don't recommend that you use that, but I do want you to be aware of that. And notice I used asterisk to select every single element on the page. We basically said for all of the elements here, let's set the margin and padding to be 0. So that's a little bit about margin and padding.